Hello and welcome to another episode of the TLDR podcast. I am Zach Michaelis, TLDR's editor-in-chief, and I am joined today by our two lead writers. You're both lead writers now, Rory Taylor.
Hello.
And Ben Blissett.
Hello.
And in this podcast, somewhat unsurprisingly, we are going to be mainly talking about the Gaza crisis, especially in the sort of context of UK politics. But as is custom on this podcast, before we get into that, we are just going to go through our unreported stories of the week.
Yes.
So I'm going to go around the table. Ben, what is your unreported story?
So I've done something a bit different this week, and I'm not doing a UK story.
That is weird.
We're going to talk about Kenya instead. So William Ruto, the president, relatively newly elected, stood on the platform of trying to sort of reduce household costs in the cost of living crisis. This week, he's tried to push through a new bit of legislation which changes the way that funding for the healthcare system works. So previously, Kenyans paid under the old system between 150 shillings and 1,700 shillings a month for access to what is nationalised healthcare. But they're now trying to change the system so that it's a flat 2.75% coming from people's income. Now, he's claiming, and his government are claiming, that this is going to massively help the healthcare system and make it easier for poorer families. But running the numbers, the BBC has found that it's actually going to increase the tax burden on the working class quite significantly. So it's not the first time that Ruto's done this, and as I say, he stood on the platform trying to reduce household costs, but he's done this elsewhere, and this is another example of this. There's also concerns that with this new system, the old system was subject to corruption and money going to all sorts of people from it, and the concern is that despite there being an increase in tax revenues, it might not actually all go to the healthcare service and might not actually help. So, a bit of a weird one. But
you've branched out there a little bit.
Yeah,
surprise.
Yeah. I mean, this is worth saying as well. This comes after months of sort of on and off protests, concerning the cost of living in Kenya. I think the other thing that's worth saying about you get quite a lot of these sort of like Africa/developing world cost of living stories at the moment. And it is worth mentioning that this is in part a function of the sort of rising cost of stuff across the world, but it's also a function of the increasing cost of borrowing in a lot of these countries. So just debt costs and bond yields are just way higher than what they used to be. And that can sound really like dry and boring. And like when you hear that US Treasury yields going up, you get all like, oh, who cares? Or when I start talking about the gilt market in the UK, you guys get really bored. But in developing countries, this just makes a massive difference to the sort of like day-to-day living.
There was a story, I think it was from, I want to say Guinea-Bissau, I think, but a Turkish power company. This isn't my underreported story, by the way. This is a bonus.
Wow.
A Turkish power company is responsible for supplying power to the capital, and they just shut off power to the capital because I guess the national government couldn't afford to pay the money that they owed. Yeah. Which is kind of pretty disastrous, I guess, for the people there.
Yeah, something similar obviously is true in lots of East Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, places like Sri Lanka and Pakistan were really struggling last year to basically afford their energy imports. And that was in part because energy was going up, but also just because borrowing costs were spiking.
Yeah. I think just one thing before we move on that I should have probably brought up originally is that the when they crunched the numbers, the BBC found that the minimum contribution that will have to be made will effectively double on this change. So obviously that specifically is what will affect the poorest and the worst off in the country. So despite all this spin of it being a new system for the less well off, it's not true.
Yeah. Well, I guess they've got to find a way to fund it somehow, and that's the way they've gone for. But anyway, Rory, what is your unreported story?
I think you'll enjoy mine because it involves oil and oil prices.
I love oil.
So mine is that the US is partially easing sanctions on Venezuelan oil.
This is a great story. Yeah. Sorry, already a big fan. Yeah.
I knew you like it. So basically, it comes after a kind of partial agreement between the Venezuelan government and the Venezuelan opposition, who for years have been kind of effectively at each other's throats, but they're now kind of coming together slightly ahead of an election next year. The agreement will see international observers come and kind of oversee the election next year, as well as possibly freeing up certain candidates ahead of the presidential election next year, although that's a bit disputed at the moment. There's not all the details and it hasn't been fully hashed out. But because of this tentative deal, the US has agreed to ease some of the sanctions it imposed on Venezuela's oil, not just its oil sector, but kind of the country as a whole, back in 2018 under Donald Trump. There's kind of two parts to this. One is obviously the impact on Venezuela's political crisis. It kind of signals that there maybe is a road out. I mean, it's not a very clear path or an easy one, but it's much clearer than it was just a few years ago. And the second part is the kind of US involvement. It's not just the US being nice and saying, look, you've done this good thing, we're easing sanctions. It's very in their kind of...
it's to their advantage.
Yeah, in Biden's interest for two reasons. One, it basically will hopefully free up or like bolster the global oil market and bring prices down, which is obviously great for Biden if that happens. And two, any kind of any more interaction and kind of cooperation with the Venezuelan government might be able to stem migration to the US, which is kind of a persistent political issue. And over the last few years, there's been a big exodus of Venezuelan migrants and asylum seekers heading to the US. So that's another issue that it might be able to tackle.
Yeah, I think that this is, I mean, again, what a great story. But I really think this is such an interesting...
You really have pitched this to Zach.
Yeah, well done. Yeah. But I think the last year or so has really reminded the world of both the political and the economic sort of preeminence of oil. Like we like to think that we're moving away from it, but it is still sort of the fundamentals of the world economy. It's the fundamental of the world economy. And you've seen numerous different efforts by the Biden administration to loosen global supply because obviously when oil prices went up, well, it's just a great correlation. You can find a graph of it. There's a really perfect correlation between presidential approval ratings and oil prices. And it just is the case that when they go up, US gasoline prices go up and people get angry at their incumbent governments. And so presidential approval ratings go down. And he's tried so many different things to get oil prices to come back down. You know, he's tried sort of preemptively loosening sanctions on Iran. There's a bit of chat about that earlier last year. He was releasing barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is this just massive, it's just a reserve that the Americans have of loads of barrels of oil that they sort of release into the global market when they need to loosen supply. And there was even some chat with Saudi. I mean, you saw him sort of not even slightly, he did a full-on U-turn when it came to Saudi Arabia, having said that he'd turned them into pariah state and didn't really want to talk to MBS. You know, last year, he went sort of cap in hand and asked him to increase production, and MBS said no, and so he's been forced to turn to Venezuela. And Venezuela is obviously a difficult political compromise, but it's also worth saying that Venezuelan oil is some of the least efficiently produced and some of the dirtiest oil around. So different crude oils have different thicknesses almost. If you just imagine Venezuelan oil is really, really thick, burning it is really bad for the planet. It's some of the worst oil for the planet. So refining it is really, really not very green. And I think that the other thing that we remind of recently is the geopolitical fragility of the global oil market and the fact that all these sort of geopolitical events do end up affecting global oil markets. You know, Russia's invasion of Ukraine obviously affected global oil markets, but the chaos in the Middle East at the moment is also putting a strain on oil and gas markets. And that's in part a direct consequence of the fact that the Israelis have, sorry, this is what a rant this is, what a great story there. Direct consequence of the fact that Israelis have said that they're going to basically stop some of the production on an oil field that's off the coast of Gaza. But it's also just because everyone knows that if, like, we get war, we get chaos in the Middle East, which is home to many of the biggest oil and gas producers in the world, we are going to see disruption to the oil market and you know, all the accompanying economic dysfunction that carries with it. So, again, great story. My unreported story today is actually, I mean, it's unreported by most of the media, but we're actually doing a video on it, but I still think it's really important. It is, what's been going on for the last sort of couple of weeks or so, it is the spat in northern Syria between the Americans and the Turks. And this has been a long time in the making, and it revolves around the fact that the Americans supported the Kurds in northeastern Syria to beat back ISIS way back in 2014, and then kept their support for them for a variety of reasons. And Turkey and Erdogan really don't like this because they see Kurdish separatism as the sort of foremost threat to Turkey's territorial integrity, and generally just the integrity of the Turkish state. And so, you know, Erdogan has basically been railing about this for ages and occasionally threatening to intervene. But we got our first case of direct Turkey on America combat at the very end of last month, or maybe the very beginning of this one, when the Americans shot down a Turkish drone that had accidentally flown over a bunker containing US Special Forces. And again, as I said, it's been a long time in the making, but it is an escalation that I don't see de-escalating anytime soon, because again, neither of them have any real interest in like sort of changing course on their foreign policies. And the Turkish parliament last week basically said to Erdogan, yeah, you can keep occupying northeastern Syria for another 2 years. We want you to keep doing that. So I just see that tension getting worse. And that comes in the context of a wider downturn in sort of US-Turkey relations. Those were unreported stories. They went on for a while. Mainly my fault.
That's all right.
But let's move on then. And we're going to start with the two UN Security Council resolutions that we had earlier this week. So Ben, you want to explain what those are?
Yeah, so in essence, so the 15 members of the UN Security Council, 5 permanent members, the other 10 are rotating, and they had a vote, well, 2 votes this week, one on Monday, one on Wednesday, about 2 separate but linked sort of issues. The one on Monday was about calling for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza, on the back of the recent fighting. It was a Russian-led resolution, which, will cause some problems diplomatically. But, it had 5... Well, those that voted against were countries you wouldn't necessarily expect to be voting against a ceasefire in Gaza. So it included the United States and the United Kingdom alongside Japan and France. They had votes in favour, so China, Gabon, Mozambique, and the United Arab Emirates, and the rest were just abstentions. So that failed. Obviously, if you have one vote against, then the resolution fails. So they came back on Wednesday with a sort of separate but kind of related resolution that they put forward. So this one was actually put forward by Brazil. The only country that voted against was the United States, and this resolution called for what they phrased as humanitarian pauses, so that life-saving aid could be given to the millions of people that need it in Gaza. So again, that is obviously separate to a ceasefire. But obviously linked. I think Rory knows a little bit more about the Wednesday vote and obviously the diplomacy that went on behind the scenes, because there was quite a lot of bargaining back and forward about the exact wording. So I don't know if you want to sort of get into that a little bit.
To point out the obvious, both of these were rejected. The second one was rejected only with the US voting against, but because it's a permanent member, it can veto resolution. So that's what happened. But effectively, this Brazilian-led resolution, they did a lot of negotiating within the Security Council about the wording, and I think the move from a ceasefire, a humanitarian ceasefire, was downgraded to humanitarian pauses. So it wasn't, just to kind of demilitarize the phrasing, I guess. That was one of the things. They also managed to include full condemnation of Hamas's. I think it called it a terror attack and everything like that. The kind of things that the US and the UK had been pushing for. But despite that, the US vetoed it largely because, one, it didn't reference Israel's right to self-defense, and two, the US's ambassador to the UN said that they thought it was better to let the diplomacy on the ground play out and unfold, referring to Joe Biden being there and having negotiations. So the ambassador said, let this unfold before we try and do something from the UN level. But I think for the Brazilians in particular, having gone through all that effort to try and get the wording just right for the US effectively, only for it to be rejected is pretty tough.
Rejected as well, only by the US.
Yeah, I think it was the UK and Russia abstained, but that's not enough to defeat it. So I'm sure the Security Council will keep kind of deliberating on this, but at the moment it looks like they're unable to come to some kind of agreement.
Well, it seems as well. So the US obviously was one of the countries that rejected the Monday resolution and was the only one that rejected the Wednesday amendment. And as you say, their concerns seemed to mainly about what wasn't included than what was. So obviously, I think on the Monday vote, they were annoyed that it wasn't explicitly said in the resolution that Israel has a right to defend itself.
I think the Monday one didn't mention Hamas as well.
Yes.
And they wanted to explicitly condemn Hamas.
And the UK seems to be obviously making a very similar argument to the US. Obviously, they didn't vote against on Wednesday, but they abstained and used exactly the same justification as the US as to why they abstained, which is because it didn't include the wording of, Israel has the right to defend itself, which is interesting. I mean, in terms of the history of these sort of these UN resolutions, you were saying earlier about, we were talking in the office about this, and the US is this is something the US does quite frequently.
As effectively Israel's staunchest ally. I mean, you mentioned it, Zach, that if you look at the history of votes in the UN regarding Israel in particular, the US will definitely come down on one side consistently, and it is the side of Israel. So
it's also
kind
quite
of
interesting. Looking outside of Israel, there are quite a lot of Security Council and General Assembly resolutions that the US is the only one voting against. So, I mean, some of the classic ones, there's a recurring one on the Cuban blockade that everyone apart from the US says has to be lifted. There's the right to food, which the US and Israel are normally the only two that block that. And then I remember there was one that the Russians introduced on condemning Nazism that the Americans saw as a sort of like political point scoring exercise against Ukraine, and so vetoed that along with Ukraine. And it's, by the way, this is one of the reasons that, for example, the Chinese are so keen to basically sort of like revamp the UN, because they think it is essentially too biased to the US. And it is quite like, maybe jarring is too strong, but it's quite notable when you see these sort of things that do enjoy widespread support, at least within the UN, just being sort of like thrown out the window or thrown in the bin by the US because they're not happy with it. I think there's two interesting things about this, though. One, as we mentioned, it is a symptom of the US quite absolutist support for Israel. And I think there are two ways to read that at the moment. I think it's a bit of a shock because actually Biden, especially during the Obama years, really didn't get on with Netanyahu. And has criticised him for a variety of things, including, perhaps most notably, his like expansionist settler policies, which Biden was warning way back in 2016, 2017, was going to come to a head at some point.
Yeah.
He was, by expanding the settler program, Netanyahu was essentially ruling out the two-state solution. And that was always that had to explode at some point, essentially. But I think there are two ways of reading this, like maybe not a U-turn, but like, his sort of pro-Israel pivot. And it is also politically quite savvy for him. But he thinks it's the right thing to do, given the sort of context of the Hamas attack. But the other way, and this was something that was pitched by Gideon Rachman in the FT recently, which is that this is pragmatism, and that what the US realizes is that if you want to get Israel's ear in this, you have to be like its closest ally, you have to be a staunch supporter, you have to sort of, I think the quote was to hug them close, because anyone who sort of shows any sympathy to Hamas, even whether or not that's justified, will automatically like lose the ability to communicate with Israel. Like, you see what I mean? Like Israel just won't listen to them.
When you sorry, just to pick up there, when you say show sympathy, you said show sympathy to Hamas. Do you mean Gaza or
Gaza,
Palestine?
Sure, sorry, yeah, better word, better phrase. Yeah,
yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think those are the two ways of reading it. And the other thing I think that's really interesting about this is it does show that there are divisions within the West about how to respond to the Gaza crisis.
Yeah.
And I think that became very apparent even in the early days of the crisis. We had von der Leyen and the European Commission basically unilaterally announcing that they would be suspending aid to the Palestinian Authority, I think it was.
Yeah.
And that quickly came under fire from, I think it was a couple of EU countries, I think most conspicuously Ireland, Spain,
and I think
Norway
Luxembourg as well.
Norway's not EU, is it? Norway also.
Yeah.
And I do think that while there was relative unanimity at the beginning of this conflict, in the immediate aftermath of the Hamas attacks, you can already see divisions emerging, especially as the sort of scale of the Israeli response becomes apparent. And I think, again, it'll be interesting how that plays out. Obviously, a lot depends on the looming ground invasion and whether or not that happens. And it'll be interesting to see like how the West splits, essentially, if Israel does go for a ground invasion.
It was interesting. I saw, I can't remember who it was, a journalist or an analyst of some kind, pointing out that Biden's presence in Israel effectively meant there wouldn't be a ground invasion of Gaza while he was there. And, I think Schultz was in Israel before Biden, and now Sunak is there. It's like, for every Western leader you have in Israel, you're managing to kind of put off that ground invasion for a little bit longer, but eventually it might happen, and that's when it gets really kind of difficult.
Yeah, I think I'm more pessimistic than most. Well, I basically think that a ground invasion is still very, very likely. I mean, there's quite a lot of people talking about how the space for manoeuvre has really shrunk from Israel's perspective, and I appreciate that, and I think that the risk of regional escalation is definitely a lot higher. But I do just think Netanyahu he has always put his political survival first, and I think he also thinks it's the right thing to do. But I think that the combination of those two factors, the fact that he cannot survive politically without a ground invasion, it's just not that there's nothing short of that be a sufficient response for the Israeli public. and the fact that he really clearly does think it's the right thing to do, as do quite a lot of the Israeli public, I really think that means that it is still overwhelmingly likely to happen.
Yeah, and I mean, even if you take the kind of political equation out of it, like he and his cabinet in particular do that, their policy towards Palestine has been pretty, like, I don't know what the right word would be.
Hawkish maybe?
Yeah, let's say hawkish. And you kind of, you got the sense when the Hamas attack happened, I couldn't visualize any other response by a Netanyahu government to what has happened so far.
Yeah.
But
anyway, shall we
talk
move
about
on
the
to the UK?
response? Yeah.
There's something, I mean, not cheerier, but it's not quite
it's a bit
as
close to home,
depressing.
I suppose.
For people who aren't in the UK, unsurprisingly, the Gaza crisis it's caused a bit of consternation, especially within the Labour Party. I think it's fair to say. Sunak has unsurprisingly been pretty pro-Israel so far. It's obviously notable that the UK abstained on that security resolution, as you know, didn't vote against it as the US did, but has generally been pretty pro-Israel and is in Israel at the moment, meeting Netanyahu. But there has been a bit of a kerfuffle, let's say, within the Labour Party about how to respond to that. So does one of you want to run me through what's happened so far?
Yeah, so I think, again, very generally speaking, I think people on the left of the Labour Party have historically been more pro-Palestine. I think that's fair to say. Keir Starmer, in his conference speech, made a big point of making a big statement about the Labour Party's support for Israel, which received a standing ovation at the time. After the conference, when things developed slightly more, Starmer was asked about Israel's policy of cutting electricity and water to Gaza, to which Starmer replied, Israel has the right to defend itself. Now, that was interpreted by many as him giving support for the actions of Israel in that specific instance. People pointed out after that could constitute, breaking international law, a collective punishment, etc. Obviously, Keir Starmer's background is a human rights lawyer, so this wasn't a particularly good look for him.
We should also say that that's something the UN has now explicitly warned about.
Yes.
And like Amnesty International and basically everyone you would expect to.
The lefty lawyers, eh?
So but he'd already said he'd sort of made this statement of Israel has the right to defend itself in response to that question before any of these sort of international bodies came out warning about this. So some of the grassroots within Labour tried to get Starmer to change his position and thereby the Labour Party's position. It was mainly regional, local mayors and councillors. Not many actually ended up resigning, but there's a fear that quite a lot of them could resign based on Starmer's comments. As I say, those more on the left of the party tend to be more pro-Palestine. And this week, Starmer's spokesperson has said that when he gave that reply, he was actually referring more generally to Israel's right to defend itself, not in that particular instance. Now, obviously, whether you believe that's what he was actually sort of intending to mean at the time, that is a sort of separate question. But it does very much look like, and is being interpreted by some as a U-turn by the Labour leader, who seems to have been caught out on this human rights issue. And it demonstrates the uncomfortable position that he's in that he's trying to show his support for Israel, but obviously quite a lot of his party. And obviously, I went to the Labour Party conference, and this was as
good little drop in that.
This is a relevant detail. This was as this was all starting, and as you walked into conference and as you were about, there was a lot of Palestinian flags, a lot of Palestine groups that are aligned with Labour. It was very obvious there that there is a lot of support within the Labour Party for Palestine, which is why it was quite interesting to see that he also received a standing ovation in his conference speech when he made a big, show of support for Israel. So he is in an uncomfortable position, but he's, that comment certainly didn't help, and his subsequent, what is being perceived as a U-turn sort of shows that difficult position even in more of a clear light.
But it's not just Starmer. I mean, David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, had similar statements, and also government ministers, Foreign Secretary and whoever else. They've been explicitly asked about how do they feel about Israel's complete siege of Gaza, which is what the Israeli Defence Minister called it, by the way. And they have been, the British politicians, Labour and Conservative alike, have been very reluctant to say they don't agree with it, even kind of mildly say, well, maybe that's too far. Their response has always just been Israel has the right to defend itself as long as it's within international law. But you get to this point where that is a kind of meaningless phrase as more things happen and more international groups come out and say, look, this clearly is a breach of international law. You can't just keep saying, yes, they can do this as long as it's within international law, because the two things just don't add up.
Yeah, it's just an odd response to someone saying, well, the international law's been broken. Yeah. And you go, well, okay, if it has been broken, and you're like, well, but it has, mate.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I know what you mean. I think it's not, this isn't exclusive to Starmer, though, is it? I think you've seen this shift happen in amongst lots of politicians since the Hamas attacks. Because I think the Hamas attacks first happened, obviously leaving the barbarity aside, and it was a real political opportunity for someone like Starmer, because condemning Hamas and supporting Israel's right to self-defense in that context, in the immediate aftermath of that attack, it's very low risk. No one's disputing anything else. There was an outpouring of sort of like positive sentiment towards Israel and sympathy towards Israel. And that also allowed him to assuage concerns about anti-Semitism in Labour, whether or not they're merited, but assuage concerns some people have about those, and also distance himself from Corbyn, which is obviously something he wants to do. And I think you saw in the Conservative Party as well, is that originally there was a similarly sort of like absolute response, and then you're right, as the the drastic nature of the Israeli reaction has become apparent, people have sort of had to awkwardly step back from that. And you saw that, I think, with the government, even Cleverly. James Cleverly, the UK Foreign Secretary, was asked, he's basically said in an interview that he wanted people to show restraint. And that is a bit of a change of tone. And again, I think you're going to see you're seeing something similar happen actually across much of the Middle East as well. And a lot of the Arab countries, of course, they said that, the Hamas attacks have to be put in the context of the settler program in Israel and all that sort of thing. But originally they were pretty restrained in their criticism of Israel. And it felt like this was a real turning point in the Middle East, because it's such a stark contrast to what happened in 1973, when the preeminent threat to the Israeli state was a coalition of Arab states. And this time, the Arab states were sort of like, Hamas, you can't be doing that. That's a terrible way of articulating it, but you understand. It was condemnation of Hamas and like a relatively restrained anti-Israel response. And you're already seeing in just the last couple of weeks quite how quickly Arab sentiment has turned. I mean, I think the most stark example is the fact that MBS had its first ever meeting with Iranian President Raisi last week. And the fact that MBS made Blinken wait overnight for his meeting. So Blinken turned up in the evening, told the meeting was then, and then MBS just didn't turn up until the next morning, and then was punctual to a meeting with Raisi, is a really quite telling demonstration of quite how quickly, especially sentiment in the Middle East, has flipped on this issue.
And you've got protests like kind of anti-Israel, pro-Palestine protests now in basically every neighbouring Arab country.
Not even that, from
Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, even Turkey. Yeah. It just shows the potential for things to really escalate, I think. And I mean, I don't know, we've done videos about this and I don't know how much I want to go into it, but about the potential of Iran or Hezbollah, kind of Iran through Hezbollah, to respond fully. But there's been a few times now where they've said, look, that's it, we'll get involved, now we're going to do it. And it hasn't really happened beyond the kind of firing of rockets across the border between Lebanon and Israel. Yeah. And I don't know if that's they've kind of shown that is the extent of their response, or if there is a genuine chance that we will get like proper cross-border war.
I have such flashbacks to Ukraine here, because I had a similar argument with one of the guys, one of the US writers called Alex. He's on. We obviously talked to him about it, and we had an argument before the Ukraine war. Where I said, "There's no way Russia's actually going to invade Ukraine. It'd be madness." And I have the same vibes about the Hezbollah situation, because I'm going, that can't be. That'd be a wild decision. That'd be crazy from them. But as the tensions constantly escalate and they show no sign of de-escalating, it does just look like not the natural, but the logical conclusion to that sequence of events. And again, I think that, by the way, is also a symptom of quite how quickly public opinion has turned. Because, again, at the beginning of the conflict, they were celebrating it. But Iran and Hezbollah were at pains to distance themselves from the attack. They were saying, "Look, we didn't have any involvement in that. I know we fund Hamas, but we had no direct involvement with the attacks." And you saw a couple of airstrikes come over the northern border from southern Lebanon into Israel, but they looked like their response, the Hezbollah response, was designed to signal solidarity without actually getting involved. And that tone has really changed. And I think that's in part because originally the international community was with Israel, especially in the Middle East, and that has shifted very, very quickly. And I think now Iran see that they have sufficient diplomatic cover to basically either via proxy or directly start a war with Israel.
But I think from the perspective of Hezbollah, it's interesting because they're very different from Hamas in that Hamas is a Palestinian organization that wants to, effectively eliminate Israel and liberate, all of what they see as Palestine, whereas Hezbollah is formed out of resistance to Israeli occupation of Lebanon, which no longer, Israel is no longer in Lebanon. That's kind of their interest. I can't see it being in their interest at all to spark a proper war with Israel, because I can't see how that ends in a good result for them.
Well, I think they just want a weak Israel.
Yeah, I suppose so.
And I think that this is the best chance they're going to get to basically. That's what worries me. Is that's the argument that makes me think that an intervention by Hezbollah is relatively likely. I think they see this. Sure, it's risky, but it might be the best chance we're going to get. And I think Iran sees the same prism. I think the similar reasoning, by the way, scarily, applies to Taiwan, which is I think one of the best arguments for being wary about what happens in Taiwan is that even if an invasion of Taiwan is associated with massive risks, it's about the closing window of opportunity. Yeah. And it's about the fact that things only get harder as time goes on. For China, as the economy slows, as the population ages, as Taiwan shifts ideologically further away from China. And in Israel, I think a similar calculus applies. I think the anxiety is that, for the last, let's just say at least 3 years, 4 years or so, Israel has been normalizing relations with Arab countries. You had what it used to be Egypt and Jordan, and then there was the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco. Sudan, Morocco, and then Saudi Arabia on the cards. Israel's been getting wealthier, stronger. Hamas and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank have been basically slowly sidelined, and Iran's own relevance has been waning. And I think Iran knows that the tide has been going against it for quite some time now, and things don't look like to change. And this is a rare moment where things are finally going its way. And so from their perspective, if you are one of the Ayatollahs, you're probably thinking this is the best chance we're going to get in the near future to land, maybe not a fatal, but a serious blow on Israel.
I mean, I know you've referred to the window of opportunity there, but what do you think that window is? I know that you were saying earlier about thinking about this in terms of Russia and Ukraine, and there was a very clear sort of deadline for if this is going to happen, it will have happened.
In terms of time,
timeline.
So I think it's you don't know the time. It all depends on the ground invasion. It depends on when the ground invasion happens, if it happens in phases, and how many troops the Israelis commit to the ground invasion. So if the Israelis commit a really significant number of troops to the ground invasion, I think is sort of necessitated by the difficult nature of that invasion. Then all of a sudden there is a weakness in the north, and I think that's when Hezbollah will be tempted. And I don't think Iran will do anything directly, but via Hezbollah, that's when I think they would be tempted to get involved. And I also think the other thing from Iran's perspective is that even 10 years ago, the US was far more involved in the Middle East. The US is clearly, it's not just preoccupied with Ukraine. It does have its eyes on Asia, and it has wanted to for a very long time. I mean, it always keeps on getting pulled back to the Middle East, but it has wanted to pivot to Asia for such a long time. And sure, there are a couple of aircraft carriers in the Eastern Mediterranean, and that is something. That's not nothing. But Iran will at least be conscious of the fact that it may be hoping, let's say, it might be hoping that the US decides that fundamentally it can't fight on three fronts. The US cannot develop a strategic web of anti-China allies in Southeast Asia while supplying Ukraine, which looks like it's going to go on for a while, and then simultaneously fight what could be an escalating regional war in the Middle East without, by the way, it's worth saying, any support from its Arab neighbours. And I think this is really, really important, is that it looks like with the tide turning, Turkey, I think, has said this explicitly now, but other Middle Eastern countries are saying the same, is they will not allow, essentially, US support for Israel to go via their countries. And that really puts Israel the US at disadvantage. I mean, sure, it has the Eastern Mediterranean, but that's pretty, complicated and pretty vulnerable. But it can't supply arms via Turkey, for example. And all of a sudden, Iran looks relatively well insulated in that context. So that's my anxiety. I still think it'd be supremely costly for Hezbollah and Iran. God, this was supposed to be a UK chat, but it's escalated. Hey, but I just feel like the reasoning might be that this is the best chance we're going to get, and that's what makes me worried.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. So
well, we've got a full video on this.
We've had many videos on this.
Yes.
But yeah. So that's my anxiety at the moment. Should we move on? Do we want to talk a bit more about the UK, or shall we move on to the board?
Go on.
Well, I was going to say I only had one thing to add about the UK thing, kind of in relation to what you said. When you consider the stakes and also the thing that's happening at the moment with the number of civilians, kind of the death toll just increasing and increasing and increasing, it is depressing that the UK response is so linked to electoral calculations and how much can I show that I'm not Jeremy Corbyn kind of thing, or how much can we demonstrate we're an ally of Israel like we did with Ukraine. I find it kind of sad how much that is a part of the overall kind of calculation in the response, rather than just...
The Ukraine experience definitely confuses politicians as well, because I think they're too quick to equate those two without realising they're probably not the same.
Yeah.
I think just to add to that as well, the thing that I found kind of frustrating at times, but almost entirely predictable, is just how intensely charged the debate got almost immediately. You had people going on, news programs, and there'd be condemnation on sort of both sides for the exact wording that you used or didn't use about things. Just almost it made debate almost frustrating to watch about it, because there was so much conversation about the language being used as opposed to actual actions or the sort of substance of the matter. And I think it's getting slightly better, but certainly originally it was really quite a hard thing to watch. So yeah, I think that wasn't great.
Yeah, I mean, similar, as we said earlier, linking back, a similar thing happens at the UN. Even at that level, you get the same kind of thing on Good Morning Britain as you get in the Security Council, where if you don't sufficiently condemn one thing, you can't focus on another thing.
At least at the UN Security Council, you have Richard Madeley.
That's true.
So I think you should chair.
I think
it'd be good.
Yeah, we could do a whole episode on the horrendous way the British media has responded to this, but maybe another time. We should probably move on to the more light-hearted end to the episode.
Yeah,
with the board.
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
So this is obviously everyone's favourite bit of the podcast. We are talking about the leadership rank. What's it called?
World Leader Leaderboard, I think.
World Leader Leaderboard. Very good. And it's...
Bring in the board.
Again, we're going to go the same order as we did for Unreported Story. And shall we start with down and then finish on a high note?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Ben, who is your down for this week?
It's one of the absolute top two. I'm moving Keir Starmer down one.
Wow.
Because of his, as we've already discussed, his difficulties in communication on Israel and Gaza. I think it's been a bit of a hiccup and really shown sort of some of the divisions within the Labour Party. It's not been a particularly great week for him.
No, that's very fair. Yeah. Rory?
This is to go down.
Yeah, to go down.
I'm taking Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese down one.
You've asserted yourself as our Australia expert.
Yes, I mean, I put him there in the first place when polling suggested he was going to lose this. Well, his side was going to lose this referendum, and the Yes campaign in Australia did lose. This was about the Indigenous voice.
Oh, so he's been knocked down twice because of
that same thing.
Poor man, that's a bit unfair.
But also, I think on a kind of more long-term scale, it puts him in a difficult position because he still has to come up with an approach to Indigenous affairs effectively. But this big policy of his has been rejected, so he's in a bit of a bind on that. It also, and this kind of, I don't want to go on too much, but I was tempted to put King Charles up, and I'm not going to, but I was tempted to because I think that the rejection of the Indigenous voice vote in Australia means that there is almost no chance that Albanese will hold another referendum on abolishing the monarchy, because he is a Republican himself, and he said if he does do one, it will be in his second term, assuming he gets re-elected. But this whole experience of having this big project, campaigning for it, and then having it rejected, I think that will make him think, I'm not going to do another referendum.
Can I unilaterally, as podcast hosts, put Charles up? I think that's a great reasoning. Could you do it?
King Charles, you're going up.
Whoa. Okay.
I just think it'd be quite funny for this whole, like, what does it say about our politics to have King Charles at the very top of the board.
I think it's already got something we've got Biden at the very top, then Starmer and Charles. Yeah. Then, at the very top. I think it's I
think it's ideologically confused. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
it's all over the place. Yeah. And it's going to be made even more
just like TLDR, ideologically confused. So, it's a good reflection.
I'd say consistent. So, and for my down, I'm going for reasons we've already discussed, Benjamin Netanyahu. Yeah. And this is obviously not because of the horrifying attacks we saw in Israel the week before last. It's because in the last week or so, I think for reasons we articulated, that international support, especially in the Middle East and the Arab countries, for Israel has waned really quite significantly. Yeah. Okay, here's for the good news. So who's going up then? We obviously already have Charles.
Yeah, Charles is
but who's adding to the sky high ranks? Ben, you want to start?
I think it'd be better if Rory started.
Yes.
I don't have the face.
That feels like I've justified the King Charles one, because then we have three people.
That's true. So the person I'm putting up is Donald Tusk. Former and now incoming, presumably, Polish Prime Minister. Go here, right?
Yeah.
Basically, his coalition, along with some other opposition parties, have won enough seats for a majority in Poland, ousting the right-wing government and bringing Tusk back into power. He's kind of the saviour of the Polish centre, I suppose, and opposition, because previously the Law and Justice Party were pretty dominant, but he came back in to lead this new, this kind of revived coalition, and they've won. He's not Prime Minister yet. There's a long process, and I think the ruling party will do their best to kind of slow it down a bit, but I think
he does have such blue eyes.
He's got very blue eyes in that.
I'm interested that he's about half the size of Sanchez.
Yeah,
that's Jan's fault.
Yeah.
I was going to say, it does there's a bit of a resurgence of what we might describe as the centrist dad in Europe, because if you think about it in like a year's time, it looks like Sanchez will hold on.
Yeah.
Can have Sanchez, Tusk, Starmer, almost definitely at some point, Macron,
he's probably
Schultz.
the king of the centrist dads.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's feeling all a little bit 1990s. Early 2010s. What are you talking about?
David Cameron?
He's not really centrist. No.
No, I feel like it's more of a 2000s, late 90s film. The centrists.
Okay.
But anyway, so my one going up is, unfortunately, it is Vladimir Putin.
I'm going to need to find a reason to bring him down again next week.
But I think...
Do you want me to do it?
Yeah, sorry.
It's not great that he's that high up on the board.
It doesn't reflect our endorsement of...
No.
Yeah, but it at least reflects something, and him being that...
Well, it reflects that he's having a good time, unfortunately, which is true. Since we've started this podcast, he has been having quite a good time. I think this is for a couple of reasons. But this is something Rory mentioned last week when I basically told you to put Putin up, which is what we mentioned in the podcast. You pinned it all on me. Yeah. He's obviously benefited from the Israel war for a couple of reasons. First, it means that the Americans now have another thing to focus on militarily. Second, it's boosted oil prices, which is obviously just like it is the defining element of the Russian economy and whether or not Russia can fund its ongoing war in Ukraine. But I think the third reason is that the kerfuffle at the UN and actually the nature of the Israeli response and the way that Western leaders have been forced into at least superficially hypocritical positions vis-a-vis Ukraine and Israel has really helped, it's done damage to the West diplomatic cause vis-a-vis Ukraine and basically bolstered Putin's argument that actually the rules-based order and the sort of like the Western club, they pretend that they're about universal values, but actually when it comes down to it, it's realpolitik at the end of it all, and that they are just protecting their own strategic interests and dressing it up as something else. I don't believe that, but it has bolstered his argument, and you can see how it's going to push what you might describe as the global south away from the West, who've done a pretty good job actually of pulling them back over the course of the war in Ukraine, back towards at least the non-aligned, if not the pro-Putin camp. So that's why I think that he's a good month. There was an official he told the FT, I think he described it as a gift from God for Putin.
Really?
And saying that all the good work they've done with the global south has been undone, which is bad. So there you go. Okay, well, that is the Global Leader Leaderboard. And that is the end of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. I hope it wasn't too miserable. And if we said anything terrible or controversial about the Gaza crisis, please do let us know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you again next week.
Do you want to know in the comments? I don't know if I do want to know.
I mean, I'll do it anyway.
Yeah.
To be fair to them. So.
All right.
Sorry, Jan.
No hole in the wall.
Yeah.
Bring on the wall.
Bring on the board.
Whoa.